Goodfellas is one of the most celebrated films ever made. Henry Hill walking through the Copacabana, Jimmy Conway tipping every doorman in Manhattan, Tommy DeVito making the room laugh, Pauly Cicero at the head of the Sunday table. A wise guy life that looked almost noble from the right angle. Hollywood gave the Lucchese crew a face that audiences could envy, even admire. But the men that story was actually built on were nothing like that portrait. Jimmy Burke ordered most of the Lufthansa crew picked off within weeks of the score. Tommy DeSimone stabbed Billy Batts 30 or 40 times in a trunk after the man would not stay dead. Paul Vario was called one of the most violent career criminals in New York by federal prosecutors. Henry Hill spent his last years drunk dialing Howard Stern from California. Today, we are covering what Goodfellas does not show you about the real Lucchese crew. What you are about to hear is worse than anything Scorsese put on screen. Section 1. The book, the film, and the wise guy myth. Nicholas Pileggi sold America. In January of 1985, a true crime book hit American bookstores that would shape the way the country thought about the Lucchese crime family for the next 40 years. The book was called Wise Guy. The author was a New York crime reporter named Nicholas Pileggi, who had spent 2 years recording conversations with a former Lucchese associate named Henry Hill from inside the Federal Witness Protection Program. Hill had been arrested on narcotics charges in May of 1980. He had turned on his crew. He had testified in federal court against the boss of his old neighborhood and against the Irish-American gangster who had been his mentor for 25 years. By the time Pileggi found him, Hill was a man who had nothing left to protect, and a story he had been carrying since he was 12 years old. 5 years later, in September of 1990, Martin Scorsese released the film adaptation. The film was titled Goodfellas. Ray Liotta played Henry Hill. Robert De Niro played the Irish mentor. Joe Pesci played the unstable young hitman who shadowed Hill through 3 decades of work. Paul Sorvino played the capo who controlled the neighborhood. The film became one of the most influential pictures of its generation, and the picture against which every gangster movie since has been measured. The Lucchese crime family, an organization that had been operating in Brooklyn and Queens since the 1930s, was given a face that audiences could carry home with them. What audiences walked out of theaters believing they had seen was a portrait of a working criminal life that operated on its own internal code. The wise guys ate together on Sundays. They tipped doormen. They wore expensive suits. They went to nightclubs through the kitchen. They had a structure, a hierarchy, a sense of who they were and where they fit. The boss at the top of the structure was a calm father figure who hosted big family meals and handled disputes with the kind of measured authority a Hollywood audience could respect. The mentor was a charming professional who treated his crew well and earned with quiet competence. The hothead was funny, dangerous, and finally undone by his own temper. The narrator was a kid from the neighborhood who had been pulled into something larger than himself and who eventually had to walk away. The result was a portrait of organized crime that audiences could safely admire. The performances were extraordinary, the writing was sharp. The soundtrack carried the film through 3 decades of New York history with a confidence that gave the whole operation the weight of a lived-in world. None of the 4 central characters was drawn from a single real person in the way the film suggested. Each one was a composite, or a softened version of a real Lucchese figure, with the inconvenient parts of each life filed off for the screen. The first composite was the boss. Pauly Cicero, played by Paul Sorvino, was based on Paul Vario, a Lucchese capo regime who had run a crew out of an East New York junkyard since the early 1960s. Vario was the kind of operator federal prosecutors would eventually call one of the most violent and dangerous career criminals in the city of New York. The screen version was a man who hosted dinner. The real man earned an estimated $25,000 a day from gambling, loan sharking, hijacking, fencing, and labor racketeering, and ran his organization out of a bar called Gefkins. The film took his discipline and his low profile. It left out almost everything else. The second composite was The Mentor. Jimmy Conway, played by Robert De Niro, was based on James Burke, an Irish-American Lucchese associate born July 5, 1931, who could never be made because of his bloodline, and who built his career on hijacking, loan sharking, and contract violence. Burke owned a bar in South Ozone Park called Robert's Lounge. The film took his charm and his tipping habits. It left out the fact that Hill would eventually estimate Burke had been responsible for 60 to 70 lives ended across his career, and that human remains would still be turning up in Burke's old neighborhood as late as 2013. The third composite was The Hothead. Tommy DeVito, played by Joe Pesci, was based on Thomas DeSimone, a Lucchese associate born June 6, 1946, who walked through the streets of Brooklyn with a .38 revolver inside a brown paper bag, as if he were carrying lunch from the deli. Pesci was 46 years old when he played the part. The real DeSimone was in his 20s through most of the events the film covers. The screen version was a short, volatile comedian. The real DeSimone was tall, muscular, and reportedly drank a gallon of whole milk a day. The fourth figure was the narrator. Henry Hill himself sat at the center of every scene, and the film treated his voice as the trustworthy guide through a world he had spent his life inside. The composite worked as cinema. The real men did not fit together that cleanly. They turned on each other within weeks of the biggest score of their lives. The next case is the boy who walked into a cab stand at 12 years old and stayed for the next 25 years. The kid from East New York who would eventually tell the federal government everything he had ever seen. Section 2. Henry Hill, the kid from East New York, and the cab stand on Pine Street. On June 11, 1943, in the Manhattan borough of New York City, a boy was born to an Irish father and a Sicilian mother in a working-class family that already had more children than money. His name was Henry Hill, Jr. He was the third of what would eventually be 6 children. His father, Henry Hill Sr., worked as an electrician and had emigrated to the United States from Ireland at the age of 12. His mother, Carmela, was the daughter of Sicilian immigrants and worked when she could as a dressmaker. The family moved during Henry's early childhood to a section of Brooklyn that sat at the border of Brownsville and East New York, a neighborhood that during the 1940s and 1950s produced a steady stream of young men who would eventually go to work for the Lucchese organization. The block that mattered most ran along Pine Street. Across the street from the Hill family apartment was a cab stand, the Euclid Avenue Cab Company, that operated as the public-facing front for an operation run by a Lucchese capo named Paul Vario. A pizzeria called Presto Pizzeria was attached to it. Vario's brother Vito, known in the neighborhood as Tuddy, managed the day-to-day work at both locations. The cab stand dispatched almost no taxis. The pizzeria served a small amount of pizza. The actual business at both addresses was the bookmaking, loan sharking, hijacking arrangements, and fencing operations that Vario coordinated for his crew. To a boy looking out the window of an apartment across the street, the men who walked in and out of those 2 buildings were the most important figures on the block. Hill would later claim, in the opening monologue of the 1990 film adaptation, that as far back as he could remember, he had always wanted to be a gangster. The real Hill, speaking in interviews decades later, gave a different account. He said that he had wanted to be a priest as a young boy, and that the priesthood had not worked out. What pulled him toward the cab stand was the visible respect the men commanded inside the neighborhood. They wore good suits. They drove good cars. They paid for everything in cash. They were treated by every other adult on the block with the kind of careful deference that no electrician's son in the Brownsville section of Brooklyn had ever seen anywhere else. In 1955, at the age of 12, Henry Hill crossed the street and asked the men at the cab stand for a part-time job. The request was the central decision of his life. Vario put him to work running errands, parking cars, delivering messages, and learning the routine of how the front businesses operated. The pay was small. The exposure was constant. By the time Hill was 14, he had been put onto a construction job that the Vario operation controlled, where he was given a portion of a paycheck for work he was not required to actually perform. He kept some of the money for himself and gave the rest to his mother. He used the legitimate cover of the construction job to drop out of school without telling his parents. What Hill could not be was a made man. The American Mafia had operated since the early 1930s under a rule that traced back to Charles Luciano's reorganization of the five families. A formally inducted member of an Italian-American organized crime family had to be of full Italian descent on both sides. Hill's Irish father disqualified him permanently. He could earn for the family. He could be trusted with significant work. He could sit at the table at Sunday dinner. He could never take the oath, and the figures above him could never afford to forget it. The structure he was being absorbed into was the Lucchese crime family, one of the five families that had emerged from the Castellamarese War of 1930 and 1931. By the time Hill arrived at the cab stand, the family was being run from a distance, with day-to-day operations in East New York handled by Vario's crew. Vario himself reported up through the family structure to whichever boss happened to be in place. The crew he ran included a roster of figures who would eventually appear under different names in Pileggi's book and in the film adaptation that followed. Two of those figures shaped the next 25 years of Henry Hill's life. The first was James Burke, the Irish-American associate the neighborhood called Jimmy the Gent for his habit of slipping folded bills into the palms of doormen and bartenders. Burke was 12 years older than Hill, had already done significant prison time, and was building a reputation inside Vario's crew as a hijacker, a loan shark, and an enforcer. He took an interest in Hill almost immediately. The second figure was Thomas DeSimone, who arrived in Vario's orbit in 1965 at the age of 15. DeSimone was 10 years younger than Hill, came from a family already connected to the Gambino organization through his older brothers, and was already known on the block as a young man you did not provoke. The three of them, Burke, Hill, and DeSimone, would work together on hijackings, on fencing operations, on the Air France robbery of 1967, on the Lufthansa heist of 1978, and on at least one murder that the film would eventually open with. What Hill did not understand, sitting in the Euclid Avenue cab company at the age of 14, was that almost every other man he had walked in to admire would eventually die in federal custody, disappear without a body, or testify against him in open court. The cab stand was the entry point. The exit point was a federal witness protection apartment 30 years later. And a phone call to Howard Stern from a Los Angeles bar another 20 years after that. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case is the capo who ran the cab stand and the junkyard. The man Paul Sorvino made look like a father figure on screen, and who the federal government would eventually call one of the most violent career criminals in New York City. Section 3. Paul Vario, the junkyard on Avenue D, and the $25,000 day. Paul Vario was born on July 10, 1914, in Brooklyn, into a Sicilian-American family that had already begun moving its sons into the kind of street work the neighborhood offered. The family settled in East New York. By the age of 11, Paul Vario had been sent to juvenile detention for 7 months on a truancy charge. the first entry in what would become one of the longest criminal records in the borough. He grew up large, physically imposing, and slow to speak. By his late teenage years, he was already attached to the organization that would, after the Castellamarese War of 1930 and 1931, take the name of the boss, Tommy Lucchese. What Vario built across the next 5 decades did not look, from the outside, like the kind of operation a Hollywood film would eventually try to dramatize. He had no interest in being seen. He operated almost entirely out of 2 locations. The first was Gefkin's, an old German bar in East New York, where he held court most afternoons. The second was a junkyard on Avenue D, where the front gate let through the legitimate trade in scrap metal, and the back office handled the actual work. He kept the lighting low. He kept his voice low. He kept the volume of his daily business so far below the level of newspaper coverage that for years, federal investigators struggled to assemble a clear picture of what he was actually doing. What he was actually doing by the early 1970s was earning an estimated $25,000 a day. The figure came from federal estimates compiled after Henry Hill turned. The income was drawn from bookmaking across East New York, loan sharking at street rates that ran into the hundreds of percent annually, fencing of hijacked merchandise, and a controlling interest in the cargo unions that managed loads coming through John F. Kennedy International Airport. Hill would later describe the airport in a phrase that became one of the most quoted lines in the literature as the crew's personal Citibank. FBI surveillance recordings from the 1980s captured Lucchese members and associates boasting, on tape, that the family owned JFK. The boast was not entirely an exaggeration. Vario's influence over the cargo haulers union was sufficient that the threat of a strike could redirect a federal investigation away from his crew almost on command. His structure inside the Lucchese organization climbed steadily through the 1960s. After his release from a prison sentence in 1962, he was named capo regime and given oversight of his own crew. By the time Carmine Tramunti became boss of the family in 1967, Vario was operating as the unofficial consigliere, the figure other capos came to for advice on disputes the boss himself did not want to handle directly. He sat on no commission. He held no formal title above capo regime. The men in the family understood, without anyone needing to say it out loud, that the decisions Paul Vario made in the back room at Gefkin's tended to hold. The screen version of Vario, played by Paul Sorvino in the 1990 film adaptation, was a calm, almost paternal figure who hosted Sunday dinners, dispensed advice in a measured tone, and managed his crew with the kind of low-key authority a Hollywood audience could respect. The real Vario, according to federal prosecutors who built the case against him in the early 1980s, was something else entirely. The phrase the United States Attorney's Office used in court documents was that he was one of the most violent and dangerous career criminals in the city of New York. The phrase did not appear in any version of the screenplay. The violence sat underneath the discipline. Vario had 4 brothers who worked inside the operation. Tuddy ran the cab stand and the pizzeria across from the Hill family apartment. Vito and Lenny handled other pieces of the structure. The Vario family business was, in the most literal possible sense, a family business. His son, Peter Vario, would eventually be named, in Hill's account, as one of the 2 men who lured Tommy DeSimone to his death in January of 1979. The bloodlines ran through every layer of the operation. What separated Vario from a figure like John Gotti, who would emerge from the Gambino organization a decade later, was his refusal to be photographed, quoted, or noticed. He gave no interviews. He held no press conferences. He attended almost no public functions. When federal agents finally placed surveillance on the Gefkin's bar, they captured hours of him sitting at a back table with men they could only sometimes identify, drinking coffee, watching the door, and saying as little as possible. The performance was a textbook example of what a Sicilian-American capo of his generation understood the job to require. The discipline could not survive the testimony of a man who had spent 25 years inside the operation. Following Hill's cooperation with the FBI, Vario was indicted in 1984 on fraud charges related to a scheme to obtain a forged driver's license for Hill while he was in federal custody. He was convicted and sentenced to 4 years. While serving that sentence, he was indicted again in 1985 on extortion charges connected to the airport rackets. He was convicted a second time and sentenced to an additional 10 years. He never came out. Vario died of lung failure at the Federal Correctional Institution at Fort Worth, Texas, on May 3, 1988. He was 73 years old. The man Paul Sorvino had been hired to play, in a film that would begin production a year later, was already in the ground. The next case is the Irish-American mentor who walked through Paul Vario's operation with a bankroll in his pocket and a tip for every doorman. The man whose wedding day was marked by police finding his fiancée's ex-boyfriend in a dozen pieces inside the man's own car. Section 4. Jimmy Burke, the orphan who tipped every doorman in New York. On July 5, 1931, in the borough of Manhattan, a boy was born to an Irish immigrant mother from Dublin and a father whose name was never recorded in any document that survived. The mother placed him into the foster system when he was 2 years old. The surname on his birth certificate was Conway. The name he would carry for the rest of his life, Burke, came from one of the foster families that took him in during his early childhood. He moved between several placements across the next decade. The records of what happened inside those homes are incomplete. What is documented is that by the age of 13, the foster father he was living with at the time was killed in a car accident with Burke in the vehicle, and the foster mother who remained reportedly turned on him in the aftermath. He began running away. He began stealing. He began the slow drift into juvenile detention that defined the rest of his teenage years. By the late 1940s, he was selling untaxed cigarettes and untaxed liquor on the streets of New York. The work was small, the margins were thin, and the apprenticeship was the entry point that almost every young figure of his generation passed through on the way to something larger. By the early 1950s, he was associated with figures inside both the Lucchese and Colombo organizations. His Irish parentage permanently disqualified him from being formally inducted into the American Mafia, the same wall that would eventually close in front of Henry Hill. He could earn. He could be trusted. He could sit at the table. He could never take the oath. The limitation defined the shape of his career for the next 40 years. What he became inside Paul Vario's crew was the kind of associate the structure could not function without. He hijacked trucks coming off the highways feeding into John F. Kennedy International Airport. He ran a loan sharking book whose rates climbed into the hundreds of %. He managed a gambling operation out of his own bar in South Ozone Park, Queens, a place called Robert's Lounge. He owned the bar, lived above the structure of the work it covered, and used it as the operational center of his crew. He hosted parties there. He held meetings there. He ordered killings there. According to Henry Hill's later testimony, at least 2 of the men who died at Burke's orders were buried inside the basement before being moved. His nickname inside the underworld was Jimmy the Gent. The nickname came from his habit of slipping folded bills into the hands of every doorman, bartender, valet, and waiter he encountered in Manhattan. The tipping was deliberate. The image of a generous, well-mannered figure who paid for everything in cash was a useful cover for a man who, in private, was running one of the most violent crews in the borough. Henry Hill would later describe the impression the tipping made on him as a young associate. Burke would hand a doorman a folded 50 for simply holding open a door. He would hand a bartender 20 for keeping the ice cold. The work of the bar across the street, where the actual business happened, never came up in the room. The wedding day story is the one that survives most clearly in the public record. In 1962, Burke married a young woman named Mickey. During the lead-up to the ceremony, he learned that an ex-boyfriend of hers had been bothering her. On the day of the wedding, according to reporting that has been confirmed in multiple sources, police found the ex-boyfriend's remains inside the man's own car in more than a dozen separate pieces. No one was ever charged. The detail entered the Burke folklore the way the slot machines entered Frank Costello's, as the kind of story that did not need to be confirmed in court to do the work the storyteller intended. By the late 1960s, Burke had taken on the role of mentor to two younger figures in Vario's crew. The first was Henry Hill, who he had identified as a useful earner and a steady hand. The second was Thomas DeSimone, who joined the crew at 15 and treated Burke as a substitute father figure. The three of them worked the Air France robbery in 1967, an operation that pulled an estimated $420,000 from a JFK cargo terminal in a robbery that went almost unnoticed in the press. The Air France job was the prototype. The Lufthansa heist of December 1978 was the perfected version. From 1972 to 1978, Burke was held in federal prison on a conviction related to the beating of a gambler in Tampa, Florida. Hill was serving a separate sentence on related charges during overlapping years. When Burke came out, the Vario crew was waiting for him. Within months, he had begun assembling the operation that would produce the largest cash robbery in American history at the time. He would also begin assembling the operation that would, in the weeks after the score, eliminate most of the men who had carried it out. Henry Hill's later estimate of how many lives Jimmy Burke ended across his career sat at 60 to 70. The estimate has never been independently verified, and Hill himself acknowledged that he had no way to know the full count. What is documented in the public record is a long string of disappearances, frozen bodies in trailers, dismembered remains never recovered, and a 2013 FBI excavation at Burke's former Queens residence that produced human bones identified as those of a Brooklyn hijacker named Paul Katz, who had disappeared in December of 1969. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case is the young man Burke took under his wing at 15. The Lucchese associate who walked through East New York with a .38 revolver inside a brown paper bag and committed his first murder on a stranger at the age of 17. Section 5. Tommy DeSimone, the .38 in the brown paper bag. On June 6, 1946, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a boy was born into a family that had already placed 3 generations of men inside the American Mafia. His name was Thomas James DeSimone. His father, also named Thomas DeSimone, was a known figure in the West Coast underworld whose associations stretched back to the Los Angeles crime family of the 1930s. His older brothers, Anthony and Robert DeSimone, would both eventually become associates of the Gambino crime family in New York. The family relocated to Brooklyn while Tommy was still a child, and by his early teenage years, he had begun moving through the same East New York streets that produced Henry Hill and the rest of the Vario crew. In 1965, at the age of 15, DeSimone was introduced to Paul Vario through the connections his family already carried inside the New York organizations. He went to work for the crew almost immediately. The introductions inside Vario's circle put him alongside Henry Hill, who was already 22 years old and a veteran of the operation, and James Burke, who took an interest in the younger figure and began treating him as a kind of protege. Hill would later describe his first impression of DeSimone in his recorded conversations with Nicholas Pileggi. He remembered a skinny young man in a suit cut for an older figure with a pencil mustache he had grown to look the part, who carried himself with the kind of overcompensating intensity of a kid who had decided in advance that he was going to be respected or he was going to die trying. The screen version of the figure, played by Joe Pesci in the 1990 film adaptation, won an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor in March of 1991. Pesci was 46 years old when the film was shot. The character he played was short, wiry, and middle-aged. The real Thomas DeSimone, across the years the film actually covered, was a man in his 20s. He was tall. He was muscular. He reportedly drank a gallon of whole milk a day. The physical mismatch was not the only adjustment the film made. The screen version was a hot-headed comedian who killed in moments of explosive rage. The figure documented in the public record was something colder. The detail that survives most clearly in the Hill account is the brown paper bag. DeSimone walked through the streets of Brooklyn with a .38 caliber revolver inside a folded paper bag, the kind of bag a man might carry a sandwich home in. The bag was the operational tool. He could walk up to a target on the sidewalk in broad daylight, holding what looked like an ordinary lunch, and have the weapon out of the bag and into the chest of the figure across from him before the man knew anything was wrong. The technique was the opposite of the screen portrayal. It was not a temper. It was a habit. It was a way of doing the work that allowed him to operate in the open without ever drawing attention until the moment the trigger was already pulled. His first documented murder came at the age of 17. The figure he killed was a stranger named Howard Goldstein. The killing was not for money, was not for territory, was not for revenge. According to the Hill account, DeSimone shot Goldstein on the street to demonstrate to the older members of the Vario crew that he was willing to do the work. The detail is one of the most quoted in the Pileggi book and one of the most quietly removed from the film. The screen version of Tommy DeVito commits his first on-screen killing as an adult, in a moment of explosive personal grievance. The real Thomas DeSimone began his career as a teenager who killed a man he had never met to qualify for the room. The murders that followed across the next decade did not slow down. In June of 1970, he was the central figure in the killing of William Bentvena, a Gambino-made man whose nickname inside the family was Billy Bats. The murder would become the most famous sequence in the Goodfellas adaptation, and the offense that, more than any other, would seal DeSimone's own fate 9 years later. A second killing followed within weeks. Michael Gianco, a young bartender working a card game in the back of one of the crew's locations, had a verbal argument with DeSimone over a forgotten drink order. DeSimone shot him in the thigh on the spot. A week later, Gianco was serving drinks again at a follow-up game with a full leg cast. DeSimone began goading him about the leg. Gianco told him to go fuck himself. DeSimone shot him dead. The killing of Gianco appears in the film almost verbatim, played as one of Pesci's signature scenes. A third killing the same year, of a man named William Reckhow, was carried out as part of the disposal of Bentvena's body. A fourth killing in 1974 took the life of Ronald Giroth, an associate the press would later note had been a close personal protege of a rising Gambino capo named John Gotti. DeSimone had killed 2 of Gotti's people without permission. The first had been a made man, which, under the rules Charles Luciano had laid down in 1931, carried an automatic death sentence. The second had been an associate Gotti had personally protected. The clock that would eventually run out on Thomas DeSimone started in June of 1970 and ran for the next 8.5 years. His final documented murder came in December of 1978, in the days after the Lufthansa heist. The figure he killed alongside Angelo Sepe was Parnell Edwards, the Burke associate whose failure to dispose of the getaway van had given investigators the first crack in the case. Edwards was shot in his Brooklyn apartment on December 18th. DeSimone himself disappeared within weeks. The brown paper bag, the .38, and the man who had carried both for 13 years all vanished from the New York streets at almost exactly the same time. The next case is the man who got out of federal prison in May of 1970 and accepted an invitation to a welcome home party at Robert's Lounge. The Gambino-made man whose shoeshine remark would set off the most famous sequence in the Goodfellas adaptation and the chain of consequences that would end Thomas DeSimone's life. Section 6. The Billy Batts killing and the 2 weeks that followed. On February 22, 1933, in Manhattan, a boy was born to a first-generation Sicilian-Italian father and an Irish immigrant mother. His name was William Joseph Bentvena. The family eventually moved to the Arverne section of Queens. The early biographical record on the figure is unusually thin. What is documented is that, by the late 1950s, he had been pulled into the Lucchese organization through a heroin smuggling operation run by a capo named John Ormento and operating under the day-to-day management of Carmine Galante and Anthony Mira. The group was eventually called the Ormento Group in federal indictments. Bentvena joined it in May of 1958 at the age of 25. The narcotics arrest came on February 14, 1959, in Bridgeport, Connecticut, where Bentvena had traveled to complete a delivery on behalf of 2 other figures in the operation. Undercover officers took him into custody. The federal trial that followed produced a conviction in June of 1962 alongside Galante. Bentvena was sentenced to 15 years and was sent to the Federal Correctional Institution at Danbury, Connecticut. At some point between his original induction and his sentencing, he had been formally made into the Gambino family. The decision to cross from one organization into another was unusual, but not unheard of in the period, and Bentvena's connections through the heroin operation had reportedly opened the door. By the time he walked out of Danbury in May of 1970, he was a Gambino soldier with 8 years of federal time behind him, a nickname the street had given him, and a personal friendship with a rising figure in the family named John Gotti. The nickname was Billy Batts. The origin of the name has never been settled in any source. What is settled is that Bentvena was, in the language of the organization, a made man, a formally inducted member of one of the 5 families operating under the rules Charles Luciano had codified in 1931. Under those rules, the killing of a made man by an outside figure required the explicit permission of the Mafia Commission. A killing carried out without that permission carried an automatic sentence. The target himself almost never learned about the violation. The men who had killed him would learn in time that the organization had received its proof. The welcome home party for Bentvena was held at Robert's Lounge in South Ozone Park, Queens, in May of 1970. The location was Jimmy Burke's bar. The guests included most of the Vario crew. Thomas DeSimone was present. Henry Hill was present. The detail that survives most clearly in the Hill account is the conversation between Bentvena and DeSimone at the party. The 2 men had known each other in passing during DeSimone's early years on the block. Bentvena, drinking and in the mood to perform for the room, asked DeSimone whether he still shined shoes. The remark was a reference to a job DeSimone had held as a young teenager that he had spent the next decade trying to distance himself from. DeSimone, who carried a lifelong inferiority complex, sharpened by the fact that 2 of his brothers had taken work with the Gambino organization rather than with the Lucchese family that had claimed him, took the remark as the most serious insult of his life. The screen adaptation collapses what followed into a single evening. The film shows DeSimone, Burke, and Hill ending Bentvena's life in the trunk of a car on the road back from the bar. The real sequence took 2 weeks. DeSimone spent that period talking openly inside the crew about what he intended to do. Hill and Burke understood that the killing would carry the automatic sentence the rules of the organization had laid down 40 years earlier. DeSimone did not appear to care. There is also a documented secondary motive that the film leaves out entirely. While Bent Vina had been in federal prison, Burke had taken over the loan sharking book that had been Bent Vina's largest source of income. Bent Vina, on his release, had asked for the book back. Burke had refused. The shoeshine remark was the trigger. The book was the underlying reason. The killing took place at a second bar 2 weeks after the welcome home party. DeSimone pistol-whipped Bent Vina until he stopped moving. Burke joined him. Hill, by his own account, kept the door. The three men carried what they believed to be a lifeless figure to Hill's car and put him in the trunk. They stopped at DeSimone's mother's house to collect a knife, a bag of lime, and a shovel. The plan from that point was to drive the body to a dog kennel in upstate New York that Burke had access to through a friend, and to bury the figure on the property. The detail that the film handles in its own way, and that Hill described in graphic terms in his later interviews, came during the drive. Bent Vina had not been dead in the trunk. Sounds began coming from the back of the car. DeSimone and Burke pulled the car over. They opened the trunk. Bent Vina was still alive. The two men finished the killing with the shovel and a tire iron. Hill, recalling the sequence on the audio commentary for the 1990 film and again in later interviews, described the scene as the most sickening thing he had ever seen. He said the figure had been stabbed 30 or 40 times before the breathing finally stopped. The body was buried at the dog kennel in upstate New York the same night. 3 months later, the owner of the kennel informed Burke that the land had been sold to a housing developer. Burke ordered Hill and DeSimone to exhume the remains and move them. The two men went back to the property, dug up what was left of the figure, and according to Hill's account in the Pileggi book, eventually disposed of the remains in a mechanical compactor at a New Jersey junkyard owned by a man named Clyde Brooks. On the audio commentary for the film, Hill gave a slightly different account, saying the body had first been moved to the basement of Robert's lounge before the trip to the compactor. The two accounts have never been reconciled in the public record. The Gambino organization did not, in 1970, know who had killed William Bent Vina. The proof would arrive in their hands 8 years later. When it did, the clock on Thomas DeSimone began running in earnest. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case is the operation that brought Henry Hill, Jimmy Burke, and Thomas DeSimone into the same room with 5 other figures at 3 o'clock in the morning on a December night in 1978. The Lufthansa cargo terminal at John F. Kennedy International Airport and the largest cash robbery in American history at the time. Section 7. The Lufthansa heist at 3 in the morning on a December night. The information that produced the largest cash robbery in American history at the time came from a Lufthansa cargo agent named Louis Werner, who was carrying a gambling debt he could not service. Werner had been working at the airline's air freight terminal at John F. Kennedy International Airport in Queens for long enough to know the monthly schedule. Once a month, the airline flew bundles of untraceable United States currency back into the country from West Germany, the proceeds of American servicemen and American tourists who had been exchanging dollars for Deutschmarks at military bases and exchange points across Europe. The cash was converted back into dollars in Frankfurt, loaded onto a flight, carried across the Atlantic, and stored inside a high-security vault at Building 261 until the Brinks armored trucks arrived to move it into the banking system. Werner owed $20,000 to a bookmaker named Martin Krugman, who ran his book out of a wig shop in Queens. Krugman was an associate of the Vario crew. Werner told Krugman about the vault. Krugman passed the information up to Henry Hill. Hill passed it to Jimmy Burke. Burke confirmed the operational details and took the proposal to Paul Vario. Vario gave the approval. Burke worked the planning out of the back room at Robert's Lounge in South Ozone Park. The crew he assembled was small. 6 men in ski masks would carry out the entry. Vincent Asaro, a captain in the Bonanno organization whose crew controlled the airport rackets for the family that held the territory, was looped in to keep the peace between the families in exchange for a share of the proceeds. Tommy DeSimone was placed inside the entry team. Angelo Seppi, a Burke loyalist with a long record of airport hijackings, was placed inside the entry team. Joe Manry, a heavy-set associate the crew called Buddha, was also placed inside the entry team. Parnell Edwards, a longtime Burke gopher, was given the job of disposing of the van after the score was complete. At approximately 3 o'clock in the morning on Monday, December 11, 1978, a black Ford Econoline 150 van pulled up to Building 261. The crew cut the padlock at the gate with a pair of bolt cutters and entered the terminal wearing ski masks and gloves. The first employee they encountered was John Murray, a senior cargo agent working the overnight shift. Murray was taken into the lunchroom where 5 other Lufthansa employees were on their meal break. They were ordered to lie flat on the floor with their eyes closed. Murray was then forced to call upstairs to Rudy Eyrich, the night shift cargo traffic manager, who held the codes to the vault. Eyrich joined the others in the lunchroom and was made to disable the alarm system, which required opening and relocking one door before opening a second. A cargo transfer agent named Kerry Whalen returned to the building during the operation after completing an outside delivery. He noticed the van, approached it, and was pistol-whipped and dragged inside. A second curious employee stepped outside to investigate and was taken hostage in the same way. The total number of Lufthansa workers detained reached 10. What the crew found inside the vault was significantly more than they had been told to expect. The figure Werner had given Krugman had placed the cash at approximately $2 million. The actual contents were 50 boxes, each containing $125,000 in United States currency, alongside a separate container of jewelry, German currency, and silver. The total taken was approximately $5,875,000 in cash and just under $1 million in jewelry and valuables. The figure adjusted into a 2025 equivalent runs to roughly $29 million. The crew loaded the contents of the vault into the van by 4:15 in the morning. The full operation, from the bolt cutters to the moment the van pulled away from the cargo terminal, had taken approximately 1 hour and 15 minutes. No shots were fired. The Lufthansa employees were left tied but alive. The van moved off airport property and onto the surface streets of Queens. The plan from that point depended on Parnell Edwards. The van was to be driven to a New Jersey junkyard that night and put through a mechanical compactor, eliminating the single most important piece of physical evidence linking the crew to the airport. Edwards never made the trip. He parked the van at a fire hydrant in the Canarsie section of Brooklyn and went home. Police found the vehicle 2 days later. The fingerprints inside it gave investigators the first crack in the case. The next case is what Jimmy Burke decided to do about that crack. The 2 weeks after the score, when the men who had stood in the Lufthansa lunchroom began disappearing one by one. Section 8. The killings that followed. The part the film could not fit. If you stood at the corner of 102nd Road and 88th Street in South Ozone Park in the week between Christmas and New Year's of 1978, the houses on the block looked like any other working-class section of Queens. Inside one of those houses, at the bar Jimmy Burke ran around the corner, the decision had already been made. Every man who could place Burke at the planning sessions for the Lufthansa heist was going to have to disappear. The first to go was Parnell Edwards. Edwards had failed to dispose of the van. The fingerprints inside it had given investigators the first physical evidence linking the crew to the cargo terminal. On December 18, 1978, 7 days after the heist, Tommy DeSimone and Angelo Seppi went to Edwards' apartment in Ozone Park. Edwards opened the door. They shot him inside the apartment. He was 34 years old.
Martin Krugman, the bookmaker who had passed the original information up the chain, was the next to go. Krugman had been complaining to anyone who would listen that his cut of the score was not arriving.
According to Hill's later testimony, Burke and Sepp killed and dismembered Krugman approximately 1 month after the robbery. His body has never been recovered. Teresa Ferrara was a beautician in her late 20s who had been involved with multiple members of the Burke crew, including DeSimone and Sepp. She had access to information federal investigators wanted, and Burke had reason to believe she was talking. Her headless torso washed ashore on a beach in Barnegat, New Jersey in May of 1979. The remains were eventually identified through dental records. Richard Eaton was a Burke associate who had been laundering portions of the heist cash through a Florida operation. He had also, according to Burke's later belief, stolen approximately $250,000 from the proceeds. On February 18, 1979, 2 children playing in an abandoned lot in Brooklyn discovered Eaton's body inside a refrigerated tractor trailer. He had been hogtied. His body was frozen. A small address book sewn into the lining of his clothing contained the name and phone number of James Burke, a detail that gave investigators their second documented connection between Burke and the chain of disappearances. Joe Manry, the heavy-set associate the crew called Buddha, had been one of the masked men inside the terminal. He had been spending heavily in the weeks after the score. Manry was found shot in the back of the head in a parked car in Queens on May 16, 1979, alongside another heist participant named Robert McMahon. Both men had been killed at close range with a small-caliber weapon. The standard mob signature for an internal cleanup. Louis Scafora and his wife Joanna had been brought into the operation for logistical support. Scafora was reported missing in March of 1979. His wife was reported missing on the same date. Neither body has ever been recovered. The pattern across the spring of 1979 was consistent. Anyone who had touched the operation was being moved off the board, with the bodies recovered in conditions designed to send a message to anyone else who might be considering cooperation with federal investigators. The total number of lives Jimmy Burke is believed to have ended in connection with the Lufthansa cleanup has never been settled in any single source. A 2012 Biography Channel documentary placed the figure at 13. Federal investigators working the case at the time placed the figure between 8 and 10. Henry Hill's own account in the Pileggi book and in his later interviews placed the figure at slightly higher than 10. The exact number cannot be confirmed because several of the missing figures have never been recovered, and several of the recovered bodies were never formally tied to the heist in any prosecution that reached a verdict. What the 1990 film adaptation shows of this sequence is a compressed 3 or 4 killings, scored to the second half of Derek and the Dominoes, Layla, presented in a montage that lasts approximately 3 minutes of screen time. What the actual record shows is 6 to 9 months of methodical removal, carried out across 2 states by a crew that had decided in advance that the score was worth more than the lives of the men who had carried it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case is the man who walked through the entry team at JFK and who, 6 weeks after the heist, was told he was finally going to be made. The Lure, the Empty Room, and the Disappearance of Thomas DeSimone in January of 1979. Section 9. The Disappearance of Thomas DeSimone in January of 1979. In the last week of December 1978, 2 weeks after the Lufthansa score, Thomas DeSimone was given a message by Paul Vario's people. He was being put forward to be made. The induction ceremony, the formal taking of the oath that turned an associate into a soldier inside an American Mafia organization, was the moment DeSimone had been waiting for since he was 15 years old. He had spent the previous decade believing the Lucchese family would eventually clear the way. The fact that the call was finally coming, in the days after the largest cash robbery in American history, made it look like a reward for the work he had carried out inside Building 261. What DeSimone did not know was that Paul Vario had already given permission for the killing. The Gambino organization had, by some route the Hill account never fully explained,
finally received its proof on who had ended the life of William Bentvina in June of 1970. A Gambino-made man had been killed without commission permission. The rules required an automatic sentence. The Gambinos had taken the proof to Vario, presented their case, and asked for permission to move on the figure inside his own crew. Vario, by Hill's account, had agreed. There was a second motive that Hill would only describe in print years later. While Henry Hill had been serving a federal sentence in the mid-1970s, DeSimone had reportedly made an attempt on Karen Hill in the apartment she shared with the children. According to the account Hill gave in his 1994 book, Gangsters and Goodfellas, the attempt had been physical. Vario, who had been carrying on a personal relationship with Karen Hill across the same period, had been informed. In the week after Christmas, Hill and Burke flew to Florida to resolve a separate drug matter. DeSimone remained in New York to prepare for the ceremony. According to the Hill account, Peter Vario, the capo's son, and a Lucchese associate named Bruno Facciolo took DeSimone to an unmarked location on the evening of January 14, 1979. The location was not what DeSimone had been told it was. The room was almost empty. The ceremony was not going to take place. The exact sequence of what happened next has never been settled. Several accounts have circulated. According to a 1985 statement by the Gambino associate Joseph Iannuzzi, a figure named Thomas Agro claimed to have carried out the killing himself. Agro was the same figure who had earlier killed DeSimone's brother Anthony for cooperating with investigators. According to Hill's 1994 account, the killing was carried out personally by John Gotti in the presence of Agro, and Hill claimed in a 2007 appearance on The Howard Stern Show that the death had taken a long time because Bentvina had been a personal friend of Gotti's, and Gotti had wanted DeSimone to suffer before the work was finished. DeSimone's wife reported him missing the same day. His body has never been recovered. He was declared legally dead in 1990. He was 28 years old at the time of his disappearance. The screen adaptation of the killing, played in the 1990 film as a quick shot to the back of the head in a clean room with a closed coffin reference afterward, was the merciful version. The actual record points to a slower ending in a location no one in the Hill account could ever specifically name. The next case is the man who survived all of it. The narrator of the film, the cooperating witness, and the path that led from the Nassau County Jail in May of 1980 to a Los Angeles hospital bed 32 years later. Section 10. Henry Hill, the 50 convictions, and the last phone call to Howard Stern. On the afternoon of April 27, 1980, Henry Hill was arrested in Nassau County on a narcotics trafficking charge. The arrest was the culmination of a Drug Enforcement Administration surveillance operation that had been tracking a multi-state distribution operation Hill had been running out of Pittsburgh and Long Island. He was held in the Nassau County Jail. The federal government wanted information on the Lufthansa heist, on the Boston College point-shaving scheme he had been running with Burke through the 1978 and 1979 college basketball season, and on the chain of disappearances that had followed the airport job. Hill, sitting in the Nassau County Jail, was played a surveillance recording in which Burke discussed the need to have Hill removed. He was played a second recording in which Vario was told the same thing. The two figures who had brought him into the operation as a 12-year-old at the cab stand on Pine Street had decided that he was a liability. By the time the second recording finished playing,
Hill had already understood that the original Florida trip Burke had wanted him to take, the one to a bar owned by a figure the crew called Charlie the Jap, had been the setup for his own removal. He agreed to cooperate. The agreement Hill signed with the federal government required him to testify in every case the United States Attorney's Office wanted him to testify in. He was placed into the Federal Witness Protection Program with his wife Karen and their 2 children in the summer of 1980. The family was relocated repeatedly across the next 7 years. They lived for periods in Omaha, Nebraska, in Independence, Kentucky, and in Redmond, Washington. They received new names, new social security numbers, and new biographical backgrounds designed to give them cover. Hill was given training in how to operate inside those covers. The training did not take. The testimony itself ran across 4 years. Hill testified in the Boston College point-shaving trial. He testified in the federal trial that produced Burke's 12-year sentence. He testified in the trial that produced the additional 20 years to life sentence for the Richard Eaton murder. He testified in the federal trial that produced Vario's 4-year fraud conviction. He testified in the second trial that produced Vario's 10-year extortion conviction. He testified in trials against figures across the Lucchese organization and against figures in adjacent operations whose names had come up across his 25 years inside the structure. The total number of convictions his testimony produced sat at approximately 50. James Burke, the Irish-American associate who had walked Hill through the operation as a teenager, was convicted in 1982 on conspiracy charges related to the Boston College point-shaving scheme. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. While serving that sentence, Burke was convicted in 1985 of the 1979 murder of Richard Eaton and was sentenced to an additional 20 years to life. He died of cancer at the Roswell Park Cancer Institute in Buffalo, New York, on April 13, 1996. He was 64 years old. He had served the final 14 years of his life inside federal custody and had died 12 years before he would have been eligible for parole on the Eaton sentence. Paul Vario, the capo who had run the cab stand in the junkyard, was convicted in 1984 on fraud charges related to a scheme to obtain a forged driver's license for Hill while Hill was in federal custody. He was sentenced to 4 years. He was convicted again in 1985 on extortion charges related to the airport rackets and was sentenced to an additional 10 years. He died of lung failure at the Federal Correctional Institution at Fort Worth, Texas, on May 3, 1988. He was 73 years old. The man Paul Sorvino had been hired to portray in the film that was already in development at the time of his death had spent his final years inside the same federal system that had failed to hold him for 30 years before Hill walked through the door of the Nassau County Jail. The other figures around the edges of the operation followed similar trajectories. Angelo Sepe, the Burke loyalist who had carried out the killing of Parnell Edwards on December 18, 1978, was killed by his own Lucchese associates in July of 1984 over the theft of cash and narcotics from a family-affiliated distributor. Vincent Asaro, the Bonanno captain who had cleared the Lufthansa operation across organizational lines, was indicted in January of 2014 at the age of 78 on charges connected to the heist and to the 1969 murder of a Brooklyn hijacker named Paul Katz. Asaro was acquitted of all charges in November of 2015. He was arrested again in 2017 on a road rage arson charge, sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, and released in 2020. The cash and the jewelry from the Lufthansa vault have never been recovered. Henry Hill himself was kicked out of witness protection in 1987 after a cocaine trafficking arrest in Seattle. He had been giving interviews under his real name across the same period. He had also been cooperating with Nicholas Pileggi on the book that became Wise Guy, which was published by Simon & Schuster in January of 1985, and which the film adaptation followed 5 years later. The federal government had concluded that Hill could not be trusted to operate inside the program's anonymity rules. The Hill family was given a final payment and removed. He separated from Karen in 1989. They formalized the divorce in 2002. He married a second wife, Kelly Allure, in 1990, and that marriage ended in 1996. He was eventually engaged to a third partner, Lisa Caserta, with whom he lived in Topanga Canyon, California from the early 2000s onward. The arrests across the same period stacked. In 2005, he pleaded no contest to attempted methamphetamine possession in Nebraska and received 180 days in jail. Later in 2005, he was arrested on a charge of threatening his second wife and another man with a knife. In 2009, he was given 2 years of probation after pleading guilty to 2 counts of public intoxication. In December of 2009, while still on probation, he was arrested for disorderly conduct and resisting arrest in Fairview Heights, Illinois. He attributed each of the incidents, in the public interviews that followed, to his ongoing alcoholism. The public profile across the same period climbed. Hill made repeated appearances on The Howard Stern Show, often by phone and often audibly drunk on air. He sat for an interview alongside Ray Liotta for Entertainment Weekly in 2006 in a photo shoot that paired the real figure with the actor who had played him 16 years earlier. He coached Robert De Niro by phone during the filming of the 1990 adaptation on the small operational details of how Jimmy Burke had actually carried himself. He wrote a cookbook in 2002 titled The Wise Guy Cookbook, which collected recipes he claims to have learned from his mother, from inside the crew, and from his time in federal custody. He painted on canvas. He sold his work on eBay. He marketed a spaghetti sauce under his own name. He was inducted into the Museum of the American Gangster in 2010. He continued to expect, across the same period, that the men he had testified against would eventually send someone to find him. The visit never came. He died of heart failure at a Los Angeles hospital on June 12, 2012, the day after his 69th birthday. His fiancée, Lisa Caserta, told reporters that his heart had given out, that he had been sick for a long time, and that he had gone out, in her phrase, pretty peacefully for a good fella. The cause of death was officially recorded as complications from heart disease, a condition his lifetime of heavy smoking and substance use had aggressively worsened across his last decade. Step back from the individual figures. Every man who walked through Paul Vario's cab stand on Pine Street ended up dead in a federal prison medical facility, dead in a trunk, dead in a refrigerated trailer, dead in an empty room he had been told would be his induction ceremony, or dead in a Los Angeles hospital bed, wondering why nobody had ever come for him. The Wise Guy Life, the 1990 film sold to American audiences as a brotherhood with a code, was, in the actual record, a paranoid, drug-addled operation that turned on itself within 7 days of the biggest score of its career. The Sunday sauce, the doormen, the suits, the nightclubs through the kitchen, all of it sat on top of a body count the screen could only ever show in fragments. The thing the film could never quite show, the thing Scorsese was honest enough as a filmmaker to gesture at in the closing scenes, but could not fully render, is the silence on the other end of the phone in Topanga Canyon at 3 o'clock in the morning. The men Henry Hill had spent 25 years working alongside were all in the ground by the time the cameras started rolling. The film was The Wake. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.